Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome again to Syriana Analysis. I'm your host, Kevork Almassian. Thank you very much for tuning in to today's video. This is going to be about the recent interview of Tucker Carlson with the Trump's special envoy to the Middle East, Steve Witkoff. If you haven't watched it, it is around 1.5 hours covering the Middle East, West Asia, and Ukraine. I have watched it all so that you don't have to watch it. I watched it and I cut out the most important segments regarding the Middle East, and we will understand, if we read between the lines, what the Trump administration or the US empire want from the Middle East, especially after the regime change in Syria. If you have been following this channel, I've been truthful to you, unlike many other pundits, and I told you what happened in Syria is worse than the Six-Day War of 1967, and the repercussions of it are going to be enormous on the entire region, especially in regards to the players, state and non-state actors in the region who wanted to establish an independent region. By independent, I mean a region that doesn't depend on the US empire for its development, for its economies, and for its security. However, after the regime change in Syria and what preceded the regime change from October 7, the decimation of the Gaza Strip, the decapitation of Hezbollah leadership, and then the regime change war in Syria will definitely be in favor of Israel and the United States and their dominance on the region. And if we watch this interview of Tucker Carlson now with Steve Witkoff, we will understand what the United States wants next, what Israel wants next, what the Gulf countries, especially the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar, want next, and what is going to be the approach of Trump with Iran, and why the Gulf countries are coming together in order to solve the issue of Iran in collaboration with the United States and even Israel. This is going to be an exciting video. Now let's go and watch segment by segment, and I will give you my opinion about this. I'm going to be truthfully as objective as I can, not to, let's say, attack this country or that country, but to understand. It is important for us to understand what the US and Israel want in the region, and that doesn't mean they will be successful, but understanding what they want is important to understand the events and to understand the players behind, or the driving forces behind these events. So first things first, let's start with Qatar, which is a very important player in the region, and they have been instrumental in the past 20 to 30 years in implementing the US strategy in the region in order to achieve an American dominance or absolute hegemony over the region. Why? This is what we're going to understand now by watching this video. So let's take a look.
In the case of the Qataris, they're criticized for not being well motivated. It's preposterous. They are well motivated. They're good, decent people. What they want is a mediation that's effective, that gets to a peace goal. And why? Because they're a small nation and they want to be acknowledged as a peacemaker. And I think the president realizes that, and I realize that today. But we have to know that. If they had a different agenda, it would be important for us to know that different agenda. I think if they had a different agenda, it would be fine, as long as we weren't operating blind. And operating blind is really the problem in a negotiation like this. You have to know where everybody stands. So I think Qatar is a small nation, probably has the highest GDP per capita, per person, right, of anyone in the world. Huge, huge reserves. I think they want stability. I think they want a peace treaty from the United States. Why? Because, and all the Middle East, all the GCC countries want that, by the way. This is an interesting point. Everybody thinks the peace treaty is about physical defense. What it's really about is the United States providing a security wrapper so that they're all financeable. Today, you can't borrow money in those countries. So if you want to go do a deal in Saudi Arabia, in the UAE, J.P. Morgan, if they are the hypothetical bank, has to underwrite war risk. They have to underwrite, will the Houthis in Saudi Arabia fire in a hypersonic missile and destroy that AI data center that you just bought for $200 billion? That's a real problem. So a lot of these countries want defense treaties so that they're not just building out of their pocket, they're taking their oil money and they're actually leveraging it and creating a better economy long term. So I think the Qataris want stability. In the past, they've had some views that are a little bit more radical from an Islamist standpoint than they are today, but it's moderated quite a bit.
Yeah.
There's no doubt that they're an ally of the United States. There's no doubt about that. And
they have a huge air base there. I mean, U.S.
By the way, and they pay for every dollar of it. They don't have their hand out for a thing. There is nothing that the United States has to fund with regard to that airbase. That's pretty unusual.
It's amazing.
Right? So they fund everything. They don't ask for much. I think I had a conversation with General Kurilla, Eric Kurilla, who runs CENTCOM, an amazing man. And I said to him, what do you think of the Qataris? He says, they're special people. So the people in the know that they're good, decent people.
So you can communicate with Hamas through the Qataris.
Right. And Sheikh Mohammed, the prime minister of Qatar, is a good man. He's really
is.
He's a special guy. He really is. And he cares. And I've spent a lot of time with him and broken bread with him. And he's just a good, decent human being who wants what's best for his people.
There is a lot of compliments here vis-a-vis Qatar, and I'm not here to judge it, but I'm going to say that Qatar in the past 20 years, they have embedded themselves with the U.S. strategy in the region, and their role was more important than the role of Saudi Arabia and the UAE and other Gulf countries. Why? Because Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and other countries, they have taken a very clear and bold position vis-a-vis Iran, for example. And they've been so confrontational against the allies of Iran in the region, for example, Hezbollah, Hamas, and even Syria. Therefore, they have participated in a big way in trying to degrade and weaken the allies of Iran in the region. Qatar did the same in Syria, but for different reasons. Qatar also presented itself as a champion of the resistance in the region. They are supporting Hamas, they're supporting Hezbollah, they're giving them political cover, or they're giving them financial cover. This is what it was claimed in the press. But those were, in my opinion, all to buy leverage over these groups, at the same time fighting against Syria in order to weaken Iran. So Qatar played a double game here, unlike the UAE and Saudi Arabia, and it was more effective in advancing the US strategy because on one hand, it presented itself as a friendly nation to Iran. We're not fighting against Iran. We are supporting Palestine, we are supporting the resistance in Lebanon, etc. But at the same time, they were destroying Syria, which was the most important player in West Asia, which represented the supply chain, which represented the strategic debt for the so-called axis of resistance. And it presented also the access of these non-state actors between Lebanon, Palestine, Syria, Iraq, and Iran. So all this was done, or Qatar participated in a big way in weakening the Iran-led axis in the region, also at the same time playing a good relationship with Iran. So Qatari role here was very important, and this has bought Qatar leverage in Palestine, in Lebanon. Many people watch Al Jazeera. Many people are influenced by the Al Jazeera editorial line, and which represents the Qatari interests in the region and in parallel the American interests in the region. And by doing so, they have infiltrated the Palestinian ranks and they have gained the mediator status between Hamas and Israel. It is the Qatari Foreign Ministry and the Qatari intelligence participating in these negotiations between Hamas and Israel. And Qatar is a Muslim Brotherhood country. Turkey is a Muslim Brotherhood country. Hamas is a Muslim Brotherhood organization. So even the popular base of Hamas, they see Qatar as an allied country. Ideologically, they are linked to them. And nowadays, Qataris are, of course, after buying lots of leverage over the Palestinians and the Israeli destruction of the entire Gaza Strip, Qatar now presents itself as a mediator. In my opinion, they're trying to persuade Hamas to sign a deal which is not in favor of Hamas, and by doing so, they are serving the Israelis. No doubt about that. On the other hand, the Qataris also, they support the U.S. economy. They have huge investments in the US, and at the same time, they have a market for the US banks, the US techs, the US factories, and the US AI companies in Qatar and other GCC countries at the same time. However, here, for example, when you listen to the special envoy of Trump to the Middle East, he says, but how can like JP Morgans, for example, invest in Qatar or be active in Qatar when you have the Houthis, for example, firing hypersonic missiles, when you have Iran is presenting a threat to the stability of the region? By doing so, he means like challenging our dominance over the region. So it is not possible also for Qatar to be an active member in the region and help us to the maximum if there is a threat to the stability of the region or the dominance of the US in the region. Therefore, the Qataris have embedded themselves with the US empire in the region, and eventually they want and they have worked actively in destroying or trying to destroy the Iran-led axis. One of the statements recently, I believe, for Foreign Minister of Qatar, he said, yeah, we've been fighting Iran in Lebanon and Syria for 14 years. And 14 years means in 2011, when this so-called Arab Spring started and this insurgency started in Syria. And since then, Qatar has played a major role in the region in order to establish the US as a dominant power, and I truly believe that the Qatari role was more important than the Saudi role or the Emirati role in this case. The other point that he mentioned is the airbase. Now we have the Al Adid airbase of the US in Qatar. This is the largest, the biggest US airbase in the region. It hosts strategic bombers, and the Qataris are paying for it. So you have the US basically having a very important and strategic airbase in the Middle East, paid by the Qataris, costs them zero, but gives them lots of leverage over the region. It gives them the opportunity to project their military might on the region and blackmail or persuade or threaten their major foe in the region, and that is Iran. Remember, only a few months ago, when the situation between Israel, the US, and Iran reached to the point of either it's going to be confrontation or one of the sides will de-escalate, the US sent its strategic bombers to the region carrying tactical nuclear weapons, and they landed in Qatar. And the Qataris therefore played a major role in the pushing the Iranians one step back in this confrontation, because the Iranians do not want to engage in a nuclear war against the US or destroy their nation. So they preferred their national security over destroying their country or, let's say, protecting their allies in the region. So they have taken a 1 or 2 step back in this case, something that I've been arguing for now quite some time. I know that some of you guys do not like my opinion, but I am just trying to be truthful to you. Now, probably things could get again tense in the region because Trump has sent a letter to Khamenei telling him that you have 2 months to decide about the nuclear program, and after that the US may act differently. I don't know what is going to be the next step, but we are now again on a crossroad. Iranians may choose escalation or de-escalation. If you ask my opinion, I think that the Iranians will choose de-escalation in this case, and they don't want to go into an existential war against the US and Israel. Meanwhile, the players in the region, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and the rest, they are in support of the US and Israel. And at the same time, the Iranians have lost Syria completely, which means all the airbase of Syria is now exposed, and the Israelis can fly their fighter jets over the skies of Syria till the borders with Iraq to try to bomb Iran. And at the same time, they have, I don't want to say lost, however, one of their very important allies in the region, Hezbollah, has been decapitated. And what I mean by that is the leadership of Hezbollah is completely eliminated. And Hezbollah will need years, probably a decade, to recover from this major blow against this organization. So now let's continue this video. Now we're going to focus more on the Gulf countries, not only on Qatar, because in this case, we will understand that there is lots of mutual interest between these different Gulf countries, including Qatar, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain, Kuwait, etc. Let's take a look.
The Gulf Coast could be one of the most undervalued opportunities if we get peace and stability throughout the region. If we solve Iran and you can finance in that market, the Israelis are brilliant from a technological standpoint. They've got a huge technological base there.
Yes.
They're in AI, robotics, blockchain. That's where the UAE is today.
I know.
That's where Saudi Arabia is today. That's where Qatar is today. Can you imagine all these countries working collaboratively together and creating that type of market? It could be much bigger than Europe. Europe is dysfunctional today. Imagine if they became functional and everybody's a business guy there.
First things first, he is talking about the Gulf countries as a market, right? This is the vision of Trump. He is a businessman. He thinks about markets. He thinks about investments, and he thinks about the outcome which can bring beneficiaries or financial profits for the U.S. in this case, and not only for the U.S. also for Israel. And in this case, we know that Israel has advanced technological sector and advanced artificial intelligence sector, and the same thing goes for the United States. So both these countries will have great opportunities in investing in the Gulf countries, especially in Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar. And these countries are showing not only the will, but also the actual steps. They have taken actual steps in investing in these sectors. For example, this last week, one of the Emirati officials, who is not a foreign minister, who is not the head of the state, he paid a visit to the US, and I think he is now trying to invest $1.3 trillion worth of Emirati money in the US markets, mostly going to the Silicon Valley, going to the AI, going to the tech sectors. Therefore, Trump, it's not like a violation, but they abandoned one of the protocols in the US that Donald Trump receives a head of state of other country, right? And he doesn't receive, for example, someone who doesn't have this leadership position in his country, but he received this emir in his office, and he had a good conversation with him because they're investing $1.3 trillion in the US tech, Silicon Valley, and AI sectors. You know how much money is that? $1.3 trillion. And of course, some of this money is going to be recycled. It's going to be used for AI for military purposes. And this could be used, of course, against other Arabic countries in the region. So this is very major and very important thing to understand why these Gulf countries have embedded themselves with the Americans, and they have put their economies also in the service of the US, because the US represents a big opportunity, economic opportunity for them. And at the same time, the US is telling them, I can provide you the defense. And this is what the Saudis want. This is what the Emiratis want. And this is what the Qataris want, that they can immunize themselves against Iran by having the US bases and having the US soldiers and the US equipment and investment in their own country. Imagine you have all these American investments in these Gulf countries, then any attack by Iran against these countries, if, let's say, possible attack or potential attack in the future, it also means an attack against US interests. Therefore, if you remember what Trump said, that if we invest in Ukraine, if we send our companies, if we try to extract the earth minerals, we have our employees there, we have our companies. This is by itself is like immunity, like a deterrence against further Russian attacks against Ukraine. So this is how the Trump administration is thinking. And remember, like, this comes at a time that the US is, at least they say that they are separating or moving away from with their alliances with the European continent. One of the reasons for it is because Europe has become a liability for the United States. It's not beneficial. Their economies are not functional. You have great economies in Europe, but compared to these Gulf countries, no European country is capable of investing $1 trillion worth of investments in the US. The German economy, which is the largest and the biggest economy in Europe, is not even now in the first three economies in the world. And the situation is going worse. And also it's ideologically driven here. Remember what Steve said, the US Special Envoy to the Middle East. He said, the people in the Middle East, he means these leaders in Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, they're all businessmen. Like they want profits, right? Unlike in Europe, they are ideologically driven. This is what he wanted to say. In Europe, they are more ideologically driven than in these Gulf countries. And this war against Russia, in my opinion, and the preparation of lots of European countries for a big war against Russia is mostly driven by ideology, not on facts. Therefore, the US is like, okay, you can take care of Russia. I don't want to spend 200, 300, 400 billion in the future over Ukraine. I want to make profits with these Middle Eastern or Gulf countries, and this is more beneficial for me. It brings jobs, it brings investments in these countries, and also my companies can go and invest in these Gulf countries, and they're giving the American companies, in my opinion, lots of facilities to invest. Imagine if you're an American company and would like to come and invest in Germany. Do you know how much bureaucracy is here in Germany and lots of taxes? It's crazy. It doesn't make any sense for the Americans. I'm just explaining to you what the Americans think, right? So we have the Israeli investments in these countries, American investments in tech, AI. We have Basically, this is creating lots of market for the US investors, unlike in Europe. And at the end, there is a difference between a business mentality and the ideologically driven politicians in many of these European countries. Now, let's move to Israel. What does Israel want in this case?
Well, I think that's complicated. I think they're well motivated. I think there are things that they're trying to get done. As an example, we would not be as effective in what we're doing there if Bibi did not get Nasrallah out of the picture in Lebanon. If he did not decapitate, because he's effectively decapitated Hezbollah. If he did not do what he did with Hamas, he's decapitated Hamas. Hamas is nowhere close to the terrorist organization that they were beforehand. Both of those events inform on his relationship with Iran, and Iran continuing to use proxies and so forth. They're less prone to do those sorts of things today, right? And so that sort of Iranian crescent, or that Islamist crescent that everybody thought was going to be effective, it's been largely eliminated. So he's done an exceptional job with that. I would say the goal begins with, how do we deal with Iran? That's the biggie.
Yeah.
So the first is nuclear.
Yeah.
We cannot have that.
Right.
And we can talk about it in this session, how bold it was for the president to send that letter, because many would not. And that's an important thing. But I'll leave it to the end. So it begins with Iranian nuclear, but most importantly, because Iranian nuclear, if they were to have a bomb, that would create North Korea in the GCC. We cannot have that. North Korea, where they are, has outsized influence as a very small nation. We can never allow someone to have a nuclear weapon and have outsized influence. That doesn't work. So if we can solve for that, which I'm hopeful that we can, and we can talk about that too.
Yes.
The next thing we need to deal with Iran is that they're being a benefactor of these proxy armies, because we've proven that that's not existential. They, for all intents and purposes, destroyed Hezbollah. So they're not really an existential risk. Hamas, same thing. The Houthis, we're in a conflict with them today. I think we'll prove that they won't be an existential risk either. But if we can get these terrorist organizations eliminated as risks, not existential, but still risks, they're destabilizing risks, then we'll normalize everywhere.
The US sees Israel in the region as instrumental in its empire work. This is very important. I've been hearing a lot in the past that it's Israel who controls the US, and I don't really buy that. Yes, Israel has lots of influence in the US, but those are part of the US empire. You cannot really separate between Israel and the US. Israel is one of the arms of the US empire. Now, the US empire probably has lots of Zionists in it, lots of neocons in it, and there is they are embedded together. There is a mutual interest, and they think probably the same when it comes to the Middle East. Maybe sometimes they disagree tactically or even on the strategic level, but at the end of the day, it's quite clear that the US and Israel are working together in the region, and they have allies in the region. So I don't really buy the argument of many of the America First or MAGA Americans, those who say, no, we are just slaves for the for Israel lobby, and this is not what we want to do. No, the US is the empire. Israel is one of the arms of the empire in the region, and Israel has been instrumental to achieve the US objectives in the region by completely destroying Gaza. And now Trump comes and says, yeah, let's do the ethnic cleansing, like all of a sudden now they are very honest about it. They were trying to do it for over a decade or two, but now it's just in public, they're not even trying to hide it. And Israel decapitated the leadership of Hezbollah and collaborated with Turkey in initiating or starting the offensive of the Al-Qaeda terrorists from Idlib, Aleppo, and then the regime change which happened in Syria. And this is what Steve acknowledges. And he says it's a big deal that Syria is, this regime change has happened and nobody was anticipating it or expecting it to happen. Secondly, Israel is, there's a threat against Israel, right? So according to Steve, this existential threat has been diminished. So Hezbollah cannot pose an existential threat, and Hamas is the same. And now they're trying to manage the risks, not the existential threat, but the risks of Iranian allies in the region trying to cause troubles for the US and Israel, right? So they have moved from eliminating the existential threat into managing the risks in this case. And that is why now Trump sent this letter to Khamenei. I think that they're not only interested in the nuclear program, but also the role of Iran in the region and the role of Iran in supporting, let's say, Ansarullah movement or Hamas or Hezbollah or any other groups in Iraq. And they will try, and I'm not saying they will be successful, but they will try next to cut all these lines between Iran and the allies in the region. They have managed to do it in a big part in Palestine and Lebanon and in Syria. And now they will try to do even more. So the US will not stop, in my opinion, until they try to push more and more and more and corner Iran. And this is where the danger rises. So now we have 2 months. I think 1 week has already passed. So how much time we have? It was 8 weeks. Probably we have now 7 weeks or 6 weeks for Iran to respond to the US threat. What is going to be the response of Iran? I can't really tell 100%, but if you ask me, I think that Iran will choose the escalation. Iran is not in a position, in my opinion, to go into an all-out war. They will not initiate a war against the US or Israel. They will definitely defend themselves. They will definitely try to hit the American interests in the region and retaliate in a very harsh way. They have a lot of military capabilities to achieve these hits against the US interests. But think about it, what comes next after also the retaliation, especially that Iran doesn't have a nuclear weapon. US has nuclear weapons in Qatar. US has nuclear weapons through its proxy ally in Israel. So if it's existential for Iran, I think Iran will choose de-escalation. If the risks are manageable, they could probably try to do like a tet for a tet, like they did during the Operation Promise 1, Operation Promise 2. Now, Operation Promise 3 never materialized. I don't know. I don't think it will come. But if the United States, I'm saying, attacks the nuclear reactors or the nuclear facilities of Iran, definitely Iran is going to unleash a huge retaliation. But what comes after the retaliation of Iran? That is also an important question. if Iran doesn't have a nuclear weapon and doesn't have a superpower on its back. This is very important. This is very, very important. Syria is a smaller nation. In 1991, when Saddam invaded Kuwait, Syria sided with the United States. Why? Because back then the Soviet Union crumbled and Syria didn't have a superpower on its back. And Syria is a small country, it's vulnerable against the US. So the Syrians said, okay, we participate in this operation against Iraq, but US, you have to help us with the negotiations about the Golan Heights. And this was the case back then. But in my opinion, after 2015, when the Russians intervened and they finished this, let's say, helped Syria recapture 3/4 of the country, after that, the Russians were very clear. They want compromise with the US, with Turkey, with Israel, in the region, between Syria and the other Arabic countries. Russia never came to Syria to be like the US for Israel. Syria for Russia was not like Israel for the US. Israel is part of the US empire. Syria was not part of the Russian superpower, or there is no empire, Russian empire, but Syria has never been a proxy. And this is why Syria, one of the reasons why Syria lost, because it didn't have a superpower on its back that it has the will, the capabilities to go to the maximum, to the end for its ally, like the US does with Israel. The US would go to the end for Israel, and they have proven that after October 7, despite all the massacres, all the cases against Israel, all the pressure against Israel and everything, and they don't care. They have been sending weapons after weapons, and they've been protecting Israel in the international forums, in the international courts, etc., etc., because they are one. But Syria and Russia were not one. They were two separate independent countries. They had mutual interests. They have collaborated and cooperated in different cases. But when, as we say, shit hit the fan, Russia is not in a position to come and defend Syria to the end. When the Turks called the Russians and said, stay on the side, we will protect your interests in Syria, it's time for regime change, don't intervene, they have not intervened. That's the truth. So, in this case, I think Iran not having a superpower on its back, it exposes the national security of Iran. And I don't think that Russia or China will come and fight with Iran against a superpower like the US. They are not in that position, especially after the recent talks, direct talks between the US and Russia on Ukraine. They're recreating their diplomatic and security ties. So I don't think that Iran is in a position to go into an all-out war because of these reasons that I mentioned. And I hope those who are watching can understand my point, because I'm not attacking Iran, I'm just talking logic and realism. So finally, he had something to say about Jolani. Let's take a look.
I think Lebanon could normalize with Israel, literally. Normalize meaning a peace treaty with the two countries. That's really possible. Syria, too. The indications are that Jolani is a different person than he once was, and people do change. You at 55 are completely different than how you were at 35.
That's for
and
sure.
I say to myself, I'm a different person today at 68 years old. I'm not the person I knew 30 years ago. So maybe Jolani in Syria is a different guy. They've driven Iran out. Imagine if Lebanon normalizes, Syria normalizes, and the Saudis sign a normalization treaty with Israel because there's a peace in Gaza. They must have that
without question,
as a prerequisite. That's a condition precedent to Saudi normalizing. But now you'd begin to have a GCC that all work together. I mean, it would be epic.
That's the dream of the United States, to normalize the ties between Syria and Israel, normalize ties between Lebanon and Israel, and then Saudis will also jump the wagon, and this will end the Palestine issue completely. Now, he's talking positively about Jolani because of, in my opinion, one reason. Because at the current moment, the US officials are talking to the Jolani regime that if you receive Palestinians from Gaza, Probably they will also try to talk with Somalia, Eritrea, and other countries, but Syria is also an option. They will give legitimacy to Jolani if he accepts hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, and he is the most vulnerable leader in the region, and he is craving for and looking for this American legitimacy, right? Endorsement. So if Jolani says, I will receive hundreds of thousands of Palestinians to save them from a massacre, to save them from a genocide, to save them from a slaughterhouse, he will be portrayed as hero by the Gulf countries press, by Al Jazeera, by Al Arabiya, by Al Hura, by all these channels which have enormous influence on the region. They will portray him as the hero of the 21st century for saving the Palestinians and resettling them and saving them from the massacres, basically. But he will help Israel and the US in the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians. Now people are asking me, but where will he settle them? I think he will settle them in the eastern part of Syria, near the borders with Iraq, for two reasons. One, because it is far away from Israel, so he doesn't want to pose any threat on the Israel. And secondly, because if you relocate hundreds of thousands of people into a rural, impoverished, underdeveloped area like Deir ez-Zor, for example, near the borders with Iraq, where you want to degrade the influence of Iran over the Shia groups there, then you could use some of these, let's say, former Palestinian militants, if they are, some of them go there, to radicalize them. I'm all for this interpretation. I think that if you bring people from one place to another and put them in a miserable situation, there will definitely be people who use this desperation and poverty and the dire situation to hire people from the youngsters who don't have anything to eat, no jobs. So if the US and Israel are thinking about destabilizing some of the regions in Iraq, those that are under influence, let's say, of Iran, some of the Shia groups, I think that they will think of sending the Palestinians to the borders with Iraq. This could be one of the reasons, in my opinion. But if Golani rejects it, I think the plan is to balkanize Syria. Today is the 24th of March, 2025. I heard that there is a meeting on 25th of March, 2025 in the UN about Syria. And some reports say they are going to declare the coastal cities and homes as like a destroyed area or humanitarian tragedy that happened there. They will acknowledge it. Let's see. This is what I'm hearing. If that is the case, then the UN will definitely intervene to restore peace and stability and send humanitarian aid. And I think that is going to be the legal umbrella for some of the countries like Russia, like the US, to present themselves as the protector, basically, of the region. So if Jolani doesn't really obey the US strategy in the region, if he receives some Turkish objections, let's say, or if Israel presses the US immensely and the lobby in the US and the neocons press Trump, I think that they will just keep Jolani in Damascus, probably some East Homs and Hama and Idlib and Aleppo. The rest, I'm talking about the coastal cities and West Homs, it's definitely going to be in the hands of the Alawites and the Christians in the minds and the planning of the US and Israel. And I can see many of these Israeli cyber army people on X, they are communicating with Syrians in Latakia, Tartus, Jable. They're promising them protection. They're telling them, we're not your enemies. Your enemies are these Salafi jihadists, etc. We have a mutual enemy. Let's cooperate. It's happening. You can read it in Arabic. They're posting, they're communicating. And it seems that if the balkanization was a meal, the meal is ready. And the other day I said the balkanization doesn't have to be like a Sykes-Picot agreement dividing the region, like, slicing it geographically. It doesn't have to be that way. Because the balkanization has already happened in the minds of the people. After all these mass killings of Alawites and Christians in the coastal cities and homes, the people are already balkanized. They don't see themselves as part of Syria. They think in their minds that they belong into Latakia, they belong into Tartus, they belong into Jable, they belong to their sub-identity, and that is Alawism, Christian, etc., Druze, Kurds. So Balkanization has already happened psychologically and mentally in the minds of the people. Probably I'm spreading pessimism. I don't know. Let me know your opinion, seriously, because I'm talking to Syrians and this is what I'm being told on daily basis. Nobody minds in the coastal cities to separate themselves from the rest of Syria. And this is not what I want. This is not my wish. I'm literally delivering to you what I hear on a daily basis from Syrians inside Syria and their families and relatives outside Syria. But if you have a different opinion, if you heard a different comments or different things from Syrians, please let me know in the comments below. I'm all open for listening and learning from you. But until then, this was all for today. Thank you very much for tuning in to Syriana Analysis. This video was a little bit longer, but it was important for us to understand the strategy of the United States in the region so that we understand the coming events or the possible events and to evaluate them, to analyze them correctly. Because if we want to continue with the wishful thinking that I'm seeing a lot online, Israel is crumbling, US empire is falling, and this and that, then we're not really understanding what's going on. This is just my 2 cents. If you like this video, guys, I would really appreciate it if you hit the like button. Subscribe. We are less than 4,000 subscriptions away from 100K. That would be a great achievement for Syriana Analysis after 8 years for starting this YouTube channel. So if you like to support this channel, just like, subscribe, leave a comment. If you want to do more, there are different means in the description below. You can support this independent work that I am doing alone. It's a solo work. So the means are in the description below, and I will see you tomorrow on the 25th of March 2025. 25th. Peace be upon you, upon your families. Salam.